All right, guys, we're going to get started. Welcome to Mistakes to Avoid. I want to tell you that I was talking to Jeff Jones, who's the broker over at Keller Williams before this event, and we are going to put on in the future, near future, how to write a bulletproof contract as well. So keep your eyes open for that one. Thank you, Jeff, for volunteering to help us with that. Today we're going to go through a list of things that I've seen in my practice, and I asked Peggy, who you all know is my number one paralegal, real estate closer. I said, what's the one thing we need to worry about? And it was on my list. So I'd be happy I'm going to share that with you.
You said you're sure?
No. Okay, so we start today. I'm going to start with the top. Okay, I go through the contract, sort of go through the contract and come up with things that are problems that I've seen. Number one on my list, not in order of the worst problems though, is incomplete and incorrect name on the contract. Okay. Now, what does that do? If you've got an incomplete name, and I see a lot of these, I've seen frequently Jones and or assigns. And the problem with that is, who do we have a contract with? Okay, so you need to have definiteness. Buyer standpoint, the key there is also, and I train on this all the time, my suggestion is you ask the buyer, how do they want to take title? And you try to put their name on the offer exactly the way they want to take title. Because if you do that, when they go to get a mortgage, they're going to do that correctly. And we're not going to be looking at fixing things after closing and the lender's saying, oh, don't worry, we don't want to restart the loan process now that you want to put someone else on there. But you can do a quitclaim deed after closing and find out that you've got to pay deed stamps based on the amount of the mortgage that's on the property now, and what should be a couple $100 for a quitclaim deed now becomes $5,000 or $10,000. So your customers probably aren't too happy with that. And you avoid that whole problem by getting the buyer's name the way they want to take title. That requires a little more work than might be accustomed to, but I think it'd be time well spent. Might also be a time to have them talk to the attorney, because a lot of this has to do with estate planning. They're going to rent it. They're from New York particularly. They're going to put it in an LLC without any question if they're going to rent it. So you want to get that right at the beginning. Okay. Now the neighbor contract is assignable. So we can fix those things, but sometimes they don't get fixed until late in the process, and that might be too late to make it smooth and make you look good. And on the seller side, we want to get the correct name of everybody that you need to sign the agreement to convey the property so that you've got a binding contract. You need all of the owners if there's more than one. If it's an entity, you need to make sure that the person or persons signing for the entity have the authority to sign. And that may sound fairly basic, and it is, but how often do we get contracts in and we find out that the person signing the contract is using a power of attorney for a dead person? And for those of you that don't know, when a person dies, the power of attorney dies with the person who just died. So, and I've had that happen, and I've had that happen that John Jones is the seller, and it turns out it's John Jones Jr., but he has a power of attorney. That doesn't really work, because John Jones Sr. is dead. Or he's got probate open, but probate's in Ohio. That doesn't work for Florida property either. So again, you need to ask these questions, and that's a time when you ask these questions to get these lines filled in on the contract correctly. It doesn't mean really a lot more work for you, but it makes you look professional, sound professional, and write a contract that's going to work. So that's number one, incomplete or incorrect name. Number two on my list is furnished property. Now, y'all know or don't know that our market is relatively unique. Southwest Florida is one of two in the country that I'm aware of that the properties generally sell furnished, the other being Las Vegas. I don't know what the parallel is between Las Vegas and Southwest Florida, but so you understand that we're dealing with furnishings in a national mortgage financing milieu that lenders don't see. So two things you need to be careful with. The biggest mistake that I see is that people like to put in turnkey, furnished, fully furnished, as furnished, and perhaps excluding certain personal items. Now, what is wrong with all those terms? We really don't know what they mean. Okay? So the argument's going to come up that, well, that's not included, or that wasn't going, that's not the furniture that's included. It's furnished, but it doesn't include the expensive bedroom set that we just bought. So the contract itself references an attached inventory, and we're talking about the neighbor contract. So if you're going to do a furnished property, I recommend you consider trying to get an inventory done. The neighbor forms directory does have an inventory form that you can use. you've got a rental company, the rental company will have an inventory form for personal property. You also keep in mind that if your buyer is going to finance the transaction, lenders still don't like to finance personal property, and a lot of them will require either an appraisal for the value of the personal property, or will require you to take it off and put it on an addendum, and then they don't want to see the addendum. Has anyone here ever heard of mortgage fraud? And that's mortgage fraud. If you do a part of a contract and don't give the bank the entire contract, then that's mortgage fraud. So I don't want you to be guilty for that. Yes, sir. Well, if you're going to use furnishings and you're going to sell a property that's going to be mortgaged, I always recommend a separate contract for the furnishings. And drafting that contract, I believe, is practicing law, so you need an attorney to help with that. And put some reasonable consideration on that contract. So if you've got a $800,000 condo, well, the furnishings isn't worth $1. So I don't think if the furniture is not there, the seller says, don't worry, buyer, I'll give you the $1. I don't think the buyer's going to be happy with that. So is furniture for a condominium, is that worth $5,000? If they put it out on the driveway and sell it at a garage sale, is it worth $2,000? Put a reasonable amount of money on that, and they can finance $795, $797, $794 instead of $800. They'll get a loan, they close the deal, and everything works. It's not bank fraud because we've got two contracts. We're selling furniture on one hand, we're selling real estate on the other. But again, since that is what we're dealing with, you're licensed to fill in blanks on real estate sales contracts, not to draft personal property sales contracts. Now, a couple of things that I have heard over the years, I've heard some people say, my broker told me to use a bill of sale, so I don't need an attorney to draft a personal property sales contract. That's a wonderful thing. A bill of sale is a wonderful document. It conveys ownership of personal property. So if you are kind enough to draft a bill of sale for your transaction, which is also practicing law without a license, even title companies can't do bills of sale, you have now conveyed the personal property to the buyer. As soon as the seller signs it, the buyer signs it, and now the buyer has it. Now, I'm waiting the day, which will probably never come, when the buyer in that transaction that fell apart shows up with the bill of sale and says, I'm here to pick up my furniture. I have not had that happen yet, and I kind of doubt I'm going to, but it's one of those things that I kind of have nightmares about sometimes, and I giggle about it. So don't use a bill of sale. Don't use an addendum that you don't give to the bank. Don't use terms like furnished, as furnished, fully furnished, things of that nature. My suggestion is do a separate personal property sales contract, attach in a list of all the furniture that's going with it, and then have the parties sign that and make that work. Now, what about a few personal items? All furniture in the property on the whatever date that we walked through. Right? Everything else goes from the effective date of the NABOR contract. So the effective date of the NABOR contract is the last dated signature initials, right? So they went through and made an offer. They went through the property a week ago. Today's the effective date. What's in there? No one really knows, do they? Okay. I had chandeliers walk out, very expensive chandeliers, which were in MLS. You know, beautiful $25,000 chandelier. Maybe I'm dating myself. Beautiful $100,000 chandelier. But it wasn't there. It wasn't there on the effective date. It wasn't there at closing date. It wasn't there on the walkthrough, okay? Well, two things we learned from that. One, we need the inventory list of everything that stays. Two, whatever's in MLS doesn't become part of your contract. So it needs to be in your contract, so be sure that's there. Now, if we're going to exclude a few personal items.
Just one thing, Bill.
Yes.
The chandelier is attached electrically to the ceiling.
Yeah, but removing it may not cause damage to the property, so it may or may not be a fixture. Okay? That's the definition, right? A fixture, if you can't remove it without causing damage. So you take it out and put one of these plates in. I'm not real sure that that's a fixture, okay? So we've got the issue there, but I tell you, what about everything stays except the seller's personal items? How about a few personal items? That one I have had. And in that transaction, which I can remember, the few personal items was about half to 2/3 of the condominium. And legitimately so. Now, I'm thinking curio cabinet with the Hummel collection in it as a few personal items. And I represented the seller, and the seller came and explained to me the cushions on the couch were hand knitted by a niece. It just went through this whole list of everything in this place. It was very personal to this person. Now, that's a little difference of opinion between a few personal items which aren't going to stay to the buyer, and to the seller, which is everything that somebody made for me or had sentimental value that was gifted to me. And I don't think the portable TV was one of those items, but it could have been. I mean, it could have been if it came from the aunt. So So be careful when you're doing that. So if we're going to do furnishings, inventory, attached, separate contract. Now, if it's not financed, you can attach it as an addendum because we don't really care then. But anybody here ever do the pretend I'm paying cash but really getting a loan transaction? If you do, please stop doing that. It's dangerous on its own, but if you do, you're still going to need a separate contract for personal property. So give that some thought. Okay, that's number 2. Number 3, mistake in the property description. Okay. I'm not going to ask for a showing of hands, but anybody here ever transpose numbers on a phone message or an email address? No? You get those right every time? You guys are terrific. I don't. So if you do put down something like a street address for property, which you can have a binding contract, you get the numbers wrong, or you don't put in a complete legal description because it's a meets and bounds description, you don't have the proper description for the property. I had a client buy a property some years ago, called me when he came back into town next season, and he said, Bill, they're building a house on my lot. And I said, good deal, you get a free house. Turned out it wasn't his lot. The lot that he'd been shown was shown from the plat for that particular area of Marco Island, and that area had been replatted. And the difference was between an end of the canal lot and a side of the canal lot. So somebody got it wrong simply because they didn't look at the updated information. So if you get the legal wrong, you get the description of the property wrong, we don't have a contract unless you've put in at least 2 different descriptions and only one of them is wrong. That's why the neighbor contract has 2 lines, one for the street address and one for the legal. So if you put both in and you get one of them wrong, we've got an ambiguous contract. We go outside the contract and figure out what the parties really meant to buy and sell, and we can make that a contract. If you only put one in, or you put both in, and they're both wrong, we do not have a contract because we're lacking what? Meeting of the minds. Okay? And we can't fix that by going outside the contract and figuring out what did they really mean. So be really careful with those, especially those meets and bounds descriptions. My suggestion is taking a copy of the old deed and attaching that in some fashion because some of those are quite lengthy. And when we do those in my office, we always read them and reread them and read them to each other and make sure we've got every call and a meets and bounds description. You probably won't have the ability to do that. So the next best thing to me, at least, is to take something that you can attach. And all my suggestions today, by the way, are my suggestions and not those of your broker. So if you want to use any of them, you might want to check with your broker to make sure that they're okay with your broker. Okay? Number 4. In the neighbor contract, we have lines to put in parking space numbers, cabanas, storage unit, boat slips. I see those left blank a lot. And then we get to closing and somebody either wants something on the deed conveying that or they will argue about something. If we don't put those in there, then we may not have a complete contract. Even if they're limited common elements, put them in. And those little, those pound signs next to each one of those slots on the neighbor contract, that's not to put the number of them. So you don't put down there's 2 parking spaces or there's 1 cabana unit. You put the actual designation that you'll find if you got there. It's parking space E6 or cabana unit 3 or whatever it might be. And that becomes particularly important. It becomes really important with respect to boat slips as well. So be sure you fill those in. We see those are often left out, and then later on there's argument about what parking space went. I just had that happen a couple of months ago. There was an argument between the buyer and the seller about which parking spaces actually went with the unit. And they had gone back and looked, and there had a deed someplace that somebody gratuitously added parking spaces to. And they're now arguing over whether those actually came or didn't go with the unit or not go with the unit. We got it resolved, but had we had the parking space that went with the unit in the contract itself, there'd have been no dispute. Now, y'all tell me, do your customers like to see arguments and problems about the contracts that you fill the blanks in? No? There are a few realtors that seem to think that, but the majority do not, and I don't think so. I think your customers want a smooth ride from contract to closing. That starts with you making these contracts work, so be careful with that one. Another one of my favorites is math errors. I know that y'all aren't guilty of that, but we go back and we change the sale price, but we don't change something else, or we don't change the deposit, or we change the deposit, or we change the, how much is due at the end, and we don't change all the numbers. If we make one change in all the lines that has to do with the financing or the price of the property, we need to change all of them to make sure they all add up to the right number. Okay? The biggest math error that I see that causes the most pain for me as an attorney trying to close these deals is allowing a seller to accept an extremely small deposit. Now, in our market, the size of the deposit, of course, is relative. I just had a deal where the buyer walked and voluntarily relinquished a $200,000 deposit to the seller without any argument whatsoever. I was absolutely shocked that that happened, because I would have thought somebody would have at least suggested a split on 200 grand, but they said, no, we changed our mind. We've got things happening differently. We're just not going to buy the property. And I was really, really surprised. However, the bigger problem is I've seen deals where we have $1,000 deposits, or maybe even $10,000 in this market. I've had them with $100 deposits. And I have to then, when it falls apart, it's really hard for me to make the realtor, that listing agent that had that contract, come in and suggested that they sign it, to make them look good when the seller says, you mean I get $100 when they didn't close, my property's off the market for 2 months? I just met with a client. The guy came in and wanted to talk to me why he couldn't get more than the deposit. Remember the $200,000 deposit? That's the client that came in and talked to me about. He wanted more because his property was off the market for 2.5 months, and it was his impression that the market had changed in that 2.5 months. So he was very unhappy. Okay? It had gone down a little bit. Correct. So he didn't think the $200,000 was a fair estimate of the damages that he suffered. So again, I thought $200,000 was a pretty good size deposit. But again, if that had been a $20,000 deposit, I'm sure I would have had the same meeting, and the client would have been a little bit unhappier with the listing agent, not with me. I had nothing to do with it. Yes, sir.
So we've seen cases recently where they don't make the first deposit. You get a contract, goes over the weekend, the deposit's due, and the buyer doesn't make the deposit and walks away. It happened a lot more during the frenzy when people were making offers on multiple properties. But is there any recourse for a seller when the buyer doesn't make the first deposit?
Okay, the NABOR contract, the question was, what happens when the buyer doesn't make the deposit? Okay, we have 2 lines on the NABOR contract for deposit: an initial deposit and then a second additional deposit. You know, I'm not real keen on that thing that was changed in NABOR that says the deposit now can either accompany the offer, can be X number of days after the offer, it can be due on the effective date. I've never quite been sure how we get the deposit in on the effective date based on when they sign it at 8 o'clock at night. But the one where it gives them time after the effective date to put in the deposit is still a hangover from short sales, when buyers wanted to be sure that a lender was going to approve the short sale before the buyer put up any deposit money. And that made its way into our residential and vacant land as is sales contract forms. So now the buyers have these arrangements where they have a contract and it says, I'm going to put up a deposit. And the contract itself says, if the buyer defaults, seller's sole remedy is to take the deposit. Okay, that's simple enough. And it's there because the NABOR Legal Resources Committee really in the contract wanted to have black lines wherever they could, that there wouldn't be any gray, any argument, any lawsuit that would be hard to figure out. It was just real simple. Whatever the deposit is, you lose it. But the question had to do with, what if a deposit isn't made? So now we have a contract that says, hey, if the buyer defaults, the seller's sole remedy is to take the deposit, which hasn't been made. Okay, well, in my opinion, that remedy is illusory because there is no deposit. And the seller in that case, I believe, could go ahead and sue the buyer either for a specific performance or for damages because there is no deposit. Okay, and I've seen buyers do that. They think that's a cute thing to do. They put up a deal. They have 3 or 4 days while they think it over, and their decision is, gee, I don't have any liability. If I don't put up a deposit, I've got nothing to lose. Well, I think they do. Our bar contract, as you probably know, says that the buyer's loss is any deposit made and to be made under the contract. But that, again, kind of implies that we're now going to have people suing for that larger second deposit in most cases. And the Legal Resources NABOR Committee didn't think that was a good approach. So that's my opinion on what you can do with that. Have I seen people want to do that? No. As a general practice, once I explain to people that a lawsuit's going to cost $50,000 or more, it's going to take a year to 18 months to complete, they really don't get excited about filing a lawsuit. And that's fine, because that's why I explained that to them. However, they still do have that right. Okay? All right. Another area that I see problems insofar as making these deals work is offers that don't allow enough time for the other party to consider it and accept it and get it back. So my joke used to be when I trained that on Marco Island, the rule was if the offer went in the morning, they had until noon to respond, and if it came in afternoon, they had until 5 p.m. that day. Now, I know that was something that was done a little more frequently during the market frenzy that we had recently, but I can tell you I've had clients that just say, look, I'm going to throw that in the trash if they don't give us time to think about it. We, husband and wife, work in 2 separate places. We're going to talk it over tonight. So I want you to think about how do these transactions come together to make them work. The Legal Resources Committee thinks a reasonable period of time is 2 days because in the contract it says if there's a counter, that adds 2 days to whatever the deadline was to accept the original offer unless you put some other time in there. So you can put a time in the blank, and that's where everybody puts in shorter time. I have noticed in the past few years that I'm not seeing so many of those, oh, we gave you the offer at 10 a.m., you have till noon to make a decision. I think people have found that's not working very well. I don't think it puts a lot of pressure on the other side as much as it makes them not want to deal with the other party because they think they're being unreasonable. At some point during that transaction, the buyer or seller, whoever's making this, you have to tell me immediately, may want some courtesy from the other side. And when you start a transaction giving them no time whatsoever to think about the deal, it leaves a bad taste in their mouth. And I think if you later need that courtesy, you need an extra day for something, or you want to extend the mortgage financing contingency or the inspection deadline, wherever it might be, you might find that's a resounding no, because there's the remorse in that transaction isn't so much over price, but over the party. And I've had transactions where people tell me, I won't deal with them, I won't talk to them, I don't want to hear anything from them, I don't care how much money they're going to offer me, I will not sell to them. We had something with them before, and I'm not doing it. So I just don't want your transaction to end up derailed over something as silly as that. Okay? Right. Closing date. You got to fill that blank in, right? This is probably going to come as a shock. There are more than 3 days in a month. The 1st, the 30th, and the 15th are just days along with many others. So try to get in your head that the 1st, 15th, and the 30th are not your friend, because all the other realtors think those are the only 3 days in the month for closings. Okay? So if you want your deals to close smoothly, the 7th, 8th, 9th, maybe the 12th, maybe go around the 22nd, 23rd, because think about what's happening. Where are all the loans closing? The 1st, the 15th, and the 30th. And don't think that the 1st and the 30th are 2 different days. That's really just one long day, right? Okay, so let's get in a mindset of filling in a closing date that's somewhere in between. And let's look at Wednesdays. Why? Because if anything goes wrong, we've got some flexibility. So you don't just pick a day out of a hat, which I know it's easy to say the 1st, 15th, the 30th. What happens if that falls on a holiday? Anybody here ever have them come by the moving van? A closing's on Sunday? Well, the moving van's here. We should close today. Well, bank's not open. Can't get money. Okay, so look at the calendar. Look at the 15th, 30th, 1st. Cross them off your list and pick a day, if you can, that falls in the middle of the week. Certainly Thursday or Tuesday is okay, but Fridays and Mondays, no. There's just no flexibility. And don't think things go wrong. They do. Lenders drop the ball. Everybody drops the ball. Something gets screwed up. It'll happen. So pick those dates, and I think your closing will go a lot smoother. Okay? How about what I talked about earlier? Cash purchase offer, but we're really getting a mortgage. That's pretty tricky. And what happens with those deals is when the financing falls through. Anybody here get pre-approval letters? I had somebody tell me this the other day. So every time I make an offer, I get a pre-approval letter. I didn't have the heart to tell him how worthless the pre-approval letter was, but he told me I always get one that proves I can buy. I go, well, that's not done very often, but even with a pre-approval letter, y'all know that doesn't mean they're going to get a loan. But who do you think these folks that make this cash offer are going to get a mortgage, who do they blame when they lose their deposit because they couldn't get a loan? They don't blame me because I didn't talk them into that. And you didn't talk them into it either, but you let it happen. And they're going to say you talked them into it. Okay. Now you've got a liability, which your E&O carrier may or may not cover. And you've got a potential ethics complaint. So be careful with that. If you're going to do that, it's cash, but we're really getting a mortgage finance. Do something in writing to make sure that they understand how risky that is. It's not your idea. If they insist on proceeding with it, you will, but they're going to have to take some risk. And that's another time when I think you ought to offload that to the attorney and let the attorney take the risk. Anytime if you've got anything like that there's any liability and you can offload the liability, I think you ought to do that. And that's a good opportunity for you right there. Okay, how about inspections? During the market frenzy, I noted some contracts coming in, and the buyers had 3 days to complete the inspections. Anybody here been able to get a radon inspection completed in 3 days? Okay. Does anybody here think there's no radon on Marco Island? Okay. I had that question. I said, I heard there's no radon on Marco. I actually had a client one time tell me that there were no termites on Marco. Now, I had to break the news to the client. The client told me that the realtor told the client the termites couldn't get across the river. At the time, Trudy Nolan was tenting the condominium across from my office with a big yellow tent. So I asked my client if they saw the big yellow tent on the building across the street, and they said, yes, we were going to ask you what that was. When I explained, I then looked at them and I said, I guess a few termites made it across. Do you want a termite inspection report? Which they then enthusiastically said, yes. Okay. But people tend to want to save money wherever they can. They will not do inspections. They will not do surveys. They will not do any of these things. And that falls on you. But if you give them too short a time for the inspections, then it's almost worthless. Okay, we might be able to get some home inspection guy to go out and walk through the place. And that's about all you get done in 3 days. Okay, but if that's what the market is, I think you better make sure that your buyer, if you're working with a buyer, understands there's a real risk there. The other risk, though, the bigger risk that I see, and it's not necessarily your fault, it's the way that everything works here. Under the NABOR contract, open permits and unpermitted improvements are an inspection item, not a title issue. I've had realtors argue with me about that and tell me, no, I'm wrong, it's a title issue. We don't have to worry about that. It's the attorney's problem. They'll catch it. It's a title problem. They'll cure it. It's not. It's an inspection issue. Under the NABOR contract, you have one opportunity, your buyer has one opportunity to request the seller make repairs or provide a credit. One. If you make that request without checking with the attorney closing a transaction as to the status of the open permit search, we find a bunch of open permits, we can't make a complaint about it because you have just now used up the one request that's allowed under the NABOR contract with respect to inspection items. So if you're trying to be courteous and get that done as soon as possible, don't do it without checking with the attorney closing the transaction because you're going to miss the open permit issues. While we're on permits, just as a matter of trying to be helpful, whenever you show a property that is touted as newly renovated kitchen and baths, probably needs permits for those renovations because you're dealing with plumbing and electric, if nothing else. So make sure you tell whoever's closing your transaction, look for permits for these renovations because when we do a permit search, we'll turn up all the permits that have been applied for, not those that weren't. And we're not going out and looking at property and reading the MLS and making sure we understand everything unless you tell us what we need to look for. So be sure you tell the attorney closing your transaction that they need to look for any permits with respect to baths or kitchens in the past 18 months, 24 months, whatever it was that the renovations took place. And then you're off the hook, and then your customer and our client is happy if we find something and we can deal with it before closing. We can fix a lot of that stuff after closing, but every time something goes wrong, it reflects badly on you no matter what it is, and that hurts your word-of-mouth referral business, and that's the lifeblood of your industry, so you want everything to go well, okay? In the same respect, again, things that go wrong, how many people think realtors ought to do the walkthrough for their customer? That's up to you and your broker. I've been saying for years, I highly recommend that you suggest to your customer that they hire the home inspection team to go through and do the walkthrough if they can't be there personally. Because if you do the walkthrough, just as if you tell them they don't need a radon inspection, they don't need a survey because it's a vacant lot. Remember the one where somebody's building on my client's lot they thought he owned? Anytime you do any of that kind of stuff, you have now become the guarantor that everything is fine. And anybody here ever buy a house and move in and find out one of the outlets didn't work, or one of the closet doors came off the hinges? I mean, that now becomes your problem. Okay, you pay for it because it's not a lot of money, right? But your customer's still unhappy because you didn't catch it. And that might be the last you ever hear from that customer, so be careful with that. Okay? The other mistake I find in connection with inspections is that realtors confuse the amount of time for action under the residential improved contract with the as-is. Okay, so let's make sure we understand how this works. Unless you put a different time in the deadline as a deadline for the inspections, under the residential improved, the buyer gets 15 days to complete inspections, and then the buyer has 5 days after that date to notify the seller of anything that the buyer wants remediated or credit for. Okay? Under the as-is contract, the buyer gets the same 15 days from the effective date to conduct any inspections the buyer wants to conduct, but no extra 5 days to notify the seller that the buyer is terminating the contract pursuant to the clause in the as-is contract. So there's no extra 5 days, and I have had that happen more than once, where the realtor working with the buyer has been negotiating with the realtor working with the seller, and they're trying to get all the inspection issues worked out, even though under the as-is contract the buyer has no right whatsoever to ask for repairs. Still do it. And while they're negotiating, the 15 days goes by, and on the 16th day from the seller's attorney, the buyer gets an oath that says, we're not doing anything. It's an as-is contract. You had 15 days to terminate. You didn't terminate. So now the leaky roof and the busted air conditioner and the fact that the seawall is collapsing into the canal, those are all on you. Okay? So if you don't want that to happen, be sure that you don't take and add 5 days on that 15, or fall into the trap of thinking that everything's being negotiated and it's all going to be worked out and that 15-day goes by. Now, in that transaction, if that happened, I was telling the realtor working with the buyer, hey, this 15th day is coming up. You got to be careful. You got to be careful. You got to be careful. And it went by. Okay? So be careful with that. Yes?
I know that you guys supposed to use it, notice of an inspection for as is, but if you do find something and both parties agree on credit or something, then what should it just be an addendum or amendment?
Well, you can do an amendment to contract if the parties agree under any contract that they're going to give a credit. You can do an amendment to contract. But be careful with credits, though, because credits end up being unhappy news to lenders. I've seen a lot more flexibility the past few years on lenders saying, okay, it's a credit for something. We're okay with that now. And similarly with escrows, most of them don't like escrows at all. They think it's a kickback to the buyer. So you got to be careful with those, but that's how we would do that. If we're using the as-is contract and the parties agree on some type of a credit for whatever it might be, we do an amendment to contract. And anytime you're doing anything, like anytime you're drafting anything like that, again, mistakes to avoid, be careful that you're writing this. It all seems so simple and innocuous, and you can write it up. And even something as simple as a credit, I mean, I just see words that are used and they make me, cringe, because in case the parties start to disagree, we have something that I don't think is really what the parties really agreed to. So be careful with that. That's a good time to have the attorney help you draft. And better yet, if there's anything that you can find a form that's in the NABOR Forms library, use that, because that committee spends hours fly-specking those forms, and they really do a great job of addressing things that you might not even think about, such as contingent on the sale of the buyer's home. Okay, well, it's not really contingent on the sale. It's actually contingent on the closing of that sale and the disbursement of the proceeds from the sale. That's in the NABOR form, but it's not something you might put in there. So when we talk about contingent on sale, is that when it went under contract? I don't think it's what the buyer intended. The buyer needs the money from that other one. Okay, so be careful when you start drafting. Look for a form, try to use the form. Condominium documents is another area of problem. In their effort to do a great job, realtors will go to a title company and get the condominium documents and make sure the buyer gets those. No matter who you go to, unless you go to the condominium, you're only going to get the documents that are recorded in the public records. And the condominium documents require most recent annual financial statement, rules and regulations. This is two examples of documents that are not in the public records. As a general rule, You guys don't put your tax returns in public records, right? And the association is going to put their financials out there either. So you need to go to the association and get those documents. And then if you're trying to make sure your deal works, look through them. Try to make sure they're all there. Many times the condominium association trying to do the right thing gives you a budget, not the financial statement. I've had that happen a lot. Or they leave the rules and regs out. Or the most frequently asked questions and answers form. Okay? Had one a few years ago where they went and had a buyer that was backing out of the deal, and they had all the condominium documents, but they didn't get the Q&A sheet. Went to the condo and said, "Where's the Q&A sheet?" And they said, "Oh, we don't have one." That was kind of the end of the deal, okay? So be careful with that. Make sure you get those right. Now, if your property's in a homeowner association, it has the power to assess, and the assessments are mandatorily paid by the homeowners. You've also got to have a homeowner disclosure form. Okay, make sure you fill that out correctly. On that form, you're supposed to put in information only about that homeowner association, not the golf club, not the condo, not anything else, just the HOA. And you have to put that correctly in there. If you get the figures wrong, the buyer has the opportunity to terminate the transaction all the way up to closing. If you get them right, the buyer has 3 days after the buyer gets the form completed to back out of the deal if the buyer wants to. So it really behooves you to get that correctly. And for both condo documents and the HOA disclosure form, the contract itself has to have disclosure language in the condo documents that the buyer has 3 days from the day the buyer gets the documents under 718. And for HOAs, the buyer has 3 days from the date the buyer gets the disclosure form. That has to be in the contract. It's not in the FAR bar contract. You have to add it with a rider. It is in the NABOR contract. So word to the wise, if you're using a contract form that you're not familiar with, get someone who is familiar with it to work with you to make sure that you're not making a mistake. I had 3 transactions a few years ago that used a FAR bar contract for a condo. They did not attach the condo rider. And in 2 of them, I got the buyer's attorney write a letter to me. I represented the seller. I said, "We're out. We didn't get the language in the contract," and they could. The 3rd one, the realtor came to see me and said, "I don't use FAR bar very often. There's an offer here on the FAR bar contract. Can you look it over for me?" Didn't have the rider. We attached the rider and we closed that one. Okay. So be careful if you're using forms that you're not familiar with. Okay. How about drafting? At the most dangerous lines in the NABOR contract and FAR bar contract for that matter are the lines near the end of the contract. There's about a half a dozen page-wide lines. Now, I point out that you are licensed and allowed by law to fill the blanks in on a form contract. You know you can't draft, but you can fill the blanks in. Now, I have been chuckling for years at all those lines being blanks that you can fill in, because I've seen some that look like somebody is writing a composition in those lines. And I know who it was writing was the realtor. Okay, so be careful. If you're going to fill those lines in, you are really best served getting a form out of the NABOR library or getting an attorney to help you draft something, because although the NABOR library has almost everything you're ever going to need, it doesn't have everything that you're ever going to need. So if you can't find it, get an attorney to help you or get your broker to help you find it. And if you still can't find it, if you start adding more than 2 or 3 words in there, you really should get an attorney to try to help you with that. 90% of the time, it's going to go fine. No matter what you write in there and screw it up, it's going to work. But the 10% that it doesn't is the ones you have to be worried about, because then you get sued, you have an ethics complaint, and you have a licensing issue with FREC. Yes, ma'am.
Just to go back to what you were talking about previously, I've noticed, of course, in the current climate that we're in, that the monthly dues are changing a lot due to the insurances, etc. So I see a lot of realtors are adding in the personal information and private remarks, that it's on the buying agent to ensure that all of this stuff is good for their buyer, okay? Which a good buying agent should do. But when you were talking about the monthly maintenance fees there, I've often had scenarios on the buying side where the amount is incorrect. We found out, so that was fine. But you just said that we could go all the way to closing. You know, how often should that be checked? Does that protect the listing agent by putting that in? If they enter the wrong maintenance fee and the buyer agent didn't catch it?
That's an awful big question.
And
but I'll try to break it into smaller questions. Okay. Question was in MLS in private remarks. It says that the buyer's agent's responsibility to make sure that information about the HOA or the condo is correct, right? And I think that's just goes without saying it is. I don't think anybody here will argue that it isn't the buyers, anybody working with the buyers. Some has some responsibility to try to make sure that that information is correct. Certainly, the buyer is going to blame the realtor if something is not right, especially a special assessment, which oftentimes no way you can figure that one out, okay? But that doesn't get any liability off the selling on the listing agent. What it does, it just says, here's what it is. So the listing agent certainly has a vested interest in making sure that information is correct, because last time I checked, most of you don't get paid a commission unless the deal closes. So the listing agents say, hey, not my problem, it's the buyer's agent's problem. That makes no sense to me, okay? But it'll happen, okay? But the other question that you didn't ask, but it's kind of in there when you were talking, was that what happens if all the numbers change? Well, the bigger problem that I see is sometimes we'll see, well, let's put the condo documents in with MLS, or we'll put the HOA disclosure form in MLS. So there it is. Well, those change the day after they put them in. Okay, if they change the day after they put them in, you use that form and it's now no longer correct, and that's what the buyer gets. The 3 days never starts. So you want to have the current. If it's current and correct, when you give it to the buyer, you don't have to update it. Okay, even if the HOA adopts some kind of a gigantic special assessment or anything else. Now, there might be other issues about seller failure to disclose and things like that, but that wouldn't affect the validity of the HOA disclosure form. Okay.
I have actually the situation right now. I've been trying to get the financials from Resort Management in Naples, and they took over property about a month and a half ago, and they keep saying they don't have it because they don't have it from the prior management company. What do you do?
Well, the question is, we're going to the management company for a condominium association. The management company just came on board asking for financial information, and the management company says they don't have it. Well, there's not a whole lot you can do there. The condominiums are required under Chapter 718 Florida statutes to maintain adequate copies of all the documents that are to be provided under 718 to a buyer, and they don't have it. They're in violation of the statute. Doesn't help your transaction a whole lot, but that's the best you can do. I don't know that there's a way to get around that if the management company doesn't have it, and you then go to the association and try to get it from them, and you try to get the listing agent to work through the seller to get it. If they don't have it, they're not providing it. I mean, that's just, I don't think there's a way around that. And that means the buyer, as long as the buyer hasn't signed a receipt that they did get it, and if the buyer signs a receipt that they got it, they're stuck with signing a receipt that they got it. As long as the buyer hasn't signed a receipt, they've got all the way to closing to back out of the deal. Right. So I feel your pain on that.
Yeah, I reminded the Resort Management.
I understand that. Yes, ma'am.
Question. If a condo is going through renovation and they say every tenant is liable for $8,000 special assessment, and the previous owner paid a little bit of it, but still has a balance and is selling it now, does he have to pay that off at closing? Because he knew.
Good question is, what about a special assessment? That can be, it's not really a mistake made by a realtor in connection with a transaction. However, it can fall back on you, but the neighbor contract would say in that case that the assessment's already been levied, and it's levied prior to the effective date. It's the seller's expense, no matter when it's due. The seller has to pay that, okay? Now, of course, this is by contract, so again, if you're working with a different contract form, that may not be the case. So if you advise your customer, oh, don't worry about it, that's the seller's obligation, and you find out later it's not, because the contract doesn't do that, because it actually is an obligation of the property, that can be a problem. So you want to be really careful when you're crossing the threshold from fill the blanks in, sign the form, to, oh, let me advise you about all this stuff. Okay. All right, so we've got a few other things to worry about. Problems that we see come up: late delivery of a contract to the closing attorney. Why do we care about that? Well, we care about that for a few things. One, the neighbor contract says we've only got the same 15 days to check on open permits and unpermitted improvements that we do to do all the other inspections. Okay, so we're going to have a problem ordering that, getting that done. Number two, the neighbor contract says that as long as we order those permit searches within 5 days of the effective date, even if it takes longer than 15 days to get the results, we get to extend the time to complain about it beyond that 15 or 20 days for normal inspection items. Okay, so we don't get that till the 6th day after the effective date. We can't get that extra time to do the open permits and closed permit searches, which locally right now we can still get that done within 10 days, but you never know what tomorrow is going to bring. So be careful with that. The other problem, especially on a closing that's kind of far down the road, is the neighbor contract allows the buyer 30 days from the effective date to search the title. Okay. Now, on a Collier County property, generally it takes us about 48 hours to get a title search. Okay. Generally. Now, some properties had a golf course transaction, wasn't a 48-hour title search. Okay. But if we've only got 30 days to tell the seller about title defects from the effective date, and you're being kind because it's a 90-day closing, and you don't want to bother the attorney, so you don't send it over right away, and you send it over, 45 days after the effective date, we just went 15 days past the time we have to search title and complain about title defects. And who's that going to end up falling on? On the realtor, okay? Even if it's the attorney's fault, it still falls on the realtor. Everything falls on the realtor. If it's true, is it not? It's always your fault. And I tell people all the time, it's not. I have clients that complain, that realtor is the worst I ever had. And I go, why do you say that? And they'll tell me, I go, well, that's really not the realtor's fault, but nonetheless, it's in here. That's what they've decided is the case. So it's hard to dissuade that. But be careful with that. So be sure, and it doesn't hurt to send a contract to the attorney's going to close it before it's even a contract. Now we know about it. Now, if you do that, though, be careful, because I have had this happen. Contract is not a contract yet. It's an offer. It comes in. I look at it. Maybe they send it to me to look at to make sure it looks okay. I look at it. Everything's great, right? And then the realtor decides, since they sent it to me already, I don't need to see it signed. I do. I try real hard to follow up on those, okay? But if I get busy, what if something goes wrong? So if you do send something to somebody before it's a contract, send it again after it's a contract, okay? Just to make sure. And then it's prudent, call or email to make sure that they email you back and say, yeah, we got it, okay? Just in case. Not that anything would ever go wrong in my office, but I've heard of others. Okay, how about failure to get everything in writing? Does everyone here know that an oral agreement to sell real estate is not enforceable? 99.9% of the time. There's some rare exceptions, okay? So you have to have a written contract, and it has to be signed by the party to be bound. Okay? Under Florida's adoption of the Uniform Electronic Transaction Act and the Electronic Signature Act of 1996, text is not a signature. So you cannot create a real estate sales contract or amend it or change it via text. Generation Z likes to communicate solely by text. Okay? So you need to be really careful with that. And you need to tell your customer, we can't do this by text. We have to do it by email, DocuSign. What are these other ones? What are these other things you guys have out here? So all these different ones that they could sign, all that's fine under the Electronic Signature Act, but not text. So be sure you do that, okay? And get it in writing anyway, because I can't tell you that people just don't remember the handshake deals they make. And then that money ends up coming out of your pocket, and your customer's unhappy, and that's the end of that referral business. So get it always in writing, have everybody sign on it, and then if there's any question about it, have the attorney review it to make sure that the writing looks like what it's supposed to be. There are a lot of times when people, and I say, draft it, let me look at it, and let's see what we've got going on here, because I can't really understand what you're telling me. Let me see it after you write it up. Then I can ask questions and we can try to fix it. Rarely do I not change something after somebody else writes it, simply because I think I'm a good wordsmith and we try to do that. And I think most real estate attorneys will do that. Try to make it so that it works, so that your deal is going to work. But be careful with that. Be sure it's in writing. But number one problem that we have with contracts, probably failure to fill in all the blanks. Right? Everybody knows fill in the blanks. Everybody does that, right? You guys that come to these things, you always do the right stuff. You got to go out and spread the word among, everybody else. Got to fill in all the blanks. And that's a big problem, especially with a non-NABOR contract. The NABOR contract, we tried real hard on Legal Resources to make it what might be called nicely idiot-proof. so that if there's a blank and it's still blank, there's a default. No, we can do that, right? Inspection period, 15 days, right? How long for counteroffer? 2 days. What are these other things going to happen? We put all that in, but what if we don't put in one of those blanks? How much is the mortgage going to be if it's going to be a finance transaction? What's the interest rate? There's blanks for that, right? Interest rate, term, amount. We put in the wrong numbers there. We don't put anything in there. What does that mean now? Okay, so make sure you fill in all the blanks. And the FAR bar isn't as friendly as NABOR. They're not as easy to leave a blank and have it work. So let's make sure that works, because if you don't fill it in and it's material, we don't have a meeting of the minds, so we don't have a contract. And when you find that out, when the party that wants to get out of the deal goes to the party's attorney and says, hey, look through this, and here's what happened, and see if you can get me out of the deal. Okay. Most dangerous? Yes.
Have you seen with the rentals, honor rentals and how rentals are dispersed? Any examples of that at their scale? And I see, I had a few where I entered in there. One party said no, I'm not going to honor it after it closes. Is there any real leg to stand on our way to do that?
Okay, question about rentals is what happens with rentals. If they're in the property, the NABOR contract says that the seller has to provide information about all rentals that are going to have occupancy after the closing date within 5 days of the effective date. And the buyer has 5 days from the day the buyer gets that, or 5 days from the seller's deadline if the seller didn't bother to send anything to get out of the deal and get their deposit back if they don't like the rentals. But the tenant has an ownership interest in land. The ownership of land is similar to a box of pickup sticks. And each one of those little sticks is a little piece of the ownership. And the tenant has some of those sticks. Each one of those people that has a lease for the property has those sticks. So legally, they have the right to occupy and could sue not only the new owner, but also the old owner, since the old owner signed a contract with them. I have had that. I have fortunately not had that happen enough that I can say there's a consistent way to it. 95% of the time, the buyer begrudgingly accepts the tenancies and we move forward. 5% of the time, I'd suggest that the way it gets resolved is the seller pays some money and does some things and tries to find another place for the buyer, for the tenant that they had to move, because they're willing to do that. I can tell you, I haven't had any of those go to litigation. I'm happy to say that. But they generally get worked out, but they are very friction-filled and very difficult. So I feel your pain on that.
I had some, even like the association had the approval letter, and the new owners said, no, here's the new one. And it was a tough one, but I got the guy at the right spot and kept him happy. But
Well,
I felt there's some major litigation.
the problem often comes about with those minority of people, growing minority, by the way, in my experience, that want a better deal than they made. And they'll use every opportunity to try to do that. So that's one of the toughest ones to look at. That makes no sense for a lawsuit and just is there. So I can't tell you there's, not in my opinion, not a good easy way to take care of it. Okay. All right. The most dangerous to you guys is not educating your customer about wire fraud. I know you hear that all the time, and it's probably something maybe you're getting tired of hearing, but it's the number one loss of funds through these types of transactions is wire fraud. Number two, believe it or not, according to the FBI, is romance fraud. So people are stealing money, and anybody that has a Yahoo, Gmail, Google email address as a realtor should go out and get a new email address, because those are the most easily hacked. Yahoo, and so many realtors have them, and they're very easy to hack. And what happens is the hacker sits out there and monitors your email, and when they see a transaction happening, they not only try to steal the money coming in for the transaction, but they've also tried to steal commissions. Okay, so you need to be sure that your customer understands that you will never, ever, ever email or tell them anything about wire transfers. Leave that to whoever's doing the closing. All of our wire transfer instructions go out by encrypted email. We always tell them it's going to be encrypted. We're not going to send them anything else. We call them and tell them it's coming. Make sure they know that's from us. And nonetheless, we've never had anything go wrong with ours, but I've inherited clients who have lost as much as $2 million to wire fraud. And it ends up falling on you if you were in any way involved with it, because their emails, I'll tell you, the phony emails are tremendous. They look just like they should because they've been monitoring your emails. So they have everything, the logo, everything. It looks beautiful. These false people that pretend they own lots on Marco. They've got phony passports, driver's licenses. It's just the scope of what they can do is pretty amazing, pretty impressive. Okay, so be really careful as part of the transaction. Be sure you tell your people about wire fraud. Make sure that you do it in writing. Make sure you make it clear that they're not going to get anything from you about where to send their money. We're certainly not going to accept anything from anybody. We always call whoever it is supposed to get the money to make sure we've got the right information. Biggest problem we have with wires is that, notwithstanding that we say it's not the number on your check, people will still take a number off their check and give it to us to send a wire, and it doesn't work, okay? So be sure that your customers understand that too, because it's one more point of friction. If they want their money today and they don't get it till tomorrow because they screwed that up, it's not their fault, of course, right? It's yours. Okay. All right, last thing that I'm going to tell you that can go wrong with your transactions that you should be careful with, and that is not providing all the contact information and information about your customer to the attorney that's closing the transaction. We get a contract, we may get it with a transmittal form that has the name of the customer and maybe a phone number, maybe an email. You really need to give them all the phone numbers, and you may have more than one. You got a cell phone for Mrs. and a cell phone for Mr. You have a work phone number. I mean, you've been working with these people for months, maybe years in some cases. You've got 2 email addresses. Give them all, because we may need to get in touch with somebody. The closing attorney may need to get in touch with them, and if all we've got is what you gave us and it's not enough, then we try to get a hold of you. Maybe we can't reach you, and it might be a real time-sensitive issue. So get all that information. Plus, how does it look when we're asking our client, your customer, oh, do you have any other phone numbers? Do you have another address? Where do you want your mail? And they respond, we gave that to the realtor. Now, how does that look? Okay. So we don't want that to happen. So that's my last one. Anybody have any others? Yes, sir.
Do you recommend, that if you get an offer on a farm contract and the seller is going to counter that offer, that you counter it on a neighbor contract?
Question is, do I recommend that if an offer comes in on a FAR contract and the seller is going to counter, do I recommend switching to a neighbor contract? My answer is no. I don't recommend that, because I don't want your transaction to turn into a battle of the forms as opposed to a battle over price. Now, I'm not your broker, so clearly that's a question for your broker, but I look at the transaction of trying to make it close, and I think we can make a FAR contract work, but if we're not familiar with it, that's a time to get the attorney involved and go through the provisions and make sure that the seller understands those terms might be a little different than what the seller understood would be happening under a neighbor contract. Okay. Any other questions? That's just my opinion. Any other questions? Yes.
You're under contract on a Friday at 6, and about 2.5 weeks later, after giving the buyer what they were paying for insurance, you find out that the insurance is tripled. Is the onus on them prior to going under a contract to find this out? And how could they do that if that's what it says in the contract? On Friday afternoon, they don't have a wind mitigation, they don't have a 4-point, they don't have anything.
Yeah, the question is, if we go under contract and we find out 3 weeks later that the insurance costs are going to be exorbitant, and there might be a good example that would be that the seller doesn't have flood insurance, but the buyer's getting a mortgage and going to have to get flood insurance, for example. So we've got those issues. The contract says that the buyer is supposed to check on the availability and pricing of insurance before making an offer as to a property. That's where it stands right now. I know that the Legal Resources Committee is going to be discussing that, because that's becoming, it probably is the #1 issue right now in connection with real estate contracts in our area, is insurance, availability, and price. Right now, that's what the contract reads. So what does that mean for a realtor? That means a realtor better discuss those things with their customer before they make an offer, because there's not a way out of the deal if the insurance prices are really high. Now, if that isn't even a deal on, it's contingent on getting a mortgage, but the insurance costs are so high. Now, the only reason that would let somebody get out of a deal was because the cost of the insurance would change their ability to qualify for the loan, because they'd have to pay so much for insurance money. But otherwise, it doesn't affect it. And I've had that happen where somebody says, well, insurance is so high, I'm going to back out of the deal because I have to have that insurance because I'm getting a mortgage. Well, that doesn't let them back out of the deal as long as they can still get the mortgage, even if the insurance is expensive. And then that does come back and sit on your shoulders, and it's all your fault that the insurance is that expensive and you didn't warn them about it. So I'd be pointing out that paragraph in the contract if I was writing an offer on a neighbor contract. Yes, sir.
My suggestion on the Florida Realtors Insurance Committee is that you check the insurance before you write the contract. It's become such an issue, especially with flood rates on the island, that you can make a call and get a flood quote in 10 minutes. You can call an insurance, maybe you have 2 people you work with, call and get that information. Make sure you get it before you write the contract. And the other thing is, a buyer can assume a seller's flood policy. So if your flood policy is now here and the new rate is up here, the buyer can assume that and they can only raise it up 18%. It's almost like you got to check it before you write. And that's not always practical because somebody says, I want to write a contract right now, but by not checking it, it could come back to you. Why didn't you tell me the insurance was so high? Why didn't you tell me I couldn't get flood insurance? So I think it's something you have a couple of insurance people that you work with. Just make a call. I think it's so much easier than finding out afterwards.
Now you can check on insurance before you make an offer, but another thing to consider, and we were talking about that before the meeting today, is insurance is one cost of ownership. Property taxes is a cost of ownership. Maintenance and repairs is a cost of ownership. So something to consider as you're talking to your customers is you talk about the overall cost of ownership because they're comparing it to what they're paying up north. Well, the insurance down here might be a lot more, but are the property taxes lower? Are they higher? Maintenance expenses lower or higher? Is their electric bill going to be lower or higher? So I think they need to look at a package of whatever they're buying as a package of expenses and benefits, just as they were looking up north. And if you do it on that basis, it might be a little more palatable to somebody to pay a lot of money for insurance if they're paying less for property taxes or less for something else.
What do you foresee the committee doing about it on the new contract?
Don't foresee anything. I don't know what we're going to do with it. I'm waiting to have that discussion. Anybody else? Going once, going twice. Okay, we're done, folks. Good to see you all. Hope you have a great day.